Hi, students. I want to go through constitutional amendments with you. This is something that I would definitely go through in class with you, but alas, we just don't have the time to do it. So, what I want you to understand is these are the what we call amendment shortcuts here at Shanley. It actually began with Mr. Rusted. Mr. Luke Rusted's dad, actually, Randy Rusted, and Mrs. Brock has kind of adopted it, and I have too since I've started teaching APUSH. So this is kind of the shortcut method. We want you to be able to remember all 27 amendments, but I think I need to explain some of them and a little bit more of kind of the background of some of them in order to help you realize what the shortcuts that you're taking to remember these. One other thing I was going to say that I hope you listen to this beforehand and then take that little quiz. It's called like U.S. Government Constitution quiz or something like that. I have it on Haiku. Truly, all I want you to do is take the quiz without your notes to the best of your ability. Try to do your best and see how well you know the amendments. If you get less than a 50%, that's fine. I don't care. No problem. If you get a 90%, that's fine. I don't care. No problem. What I really want you to do is just start to get familiar with the amendments. So let's start with the way we remember: freedoms, guns, troops, warrant, silence. The first 5: freedoms, guns, troops, warrant, silence. Start saying those to yourself. So freedoms, we remember the acronym RAPS. And freedoms is really basic, religion, assembly, petition, press, and speech. The freedom to assemble, the freedom of religion. And obviously this comes as probably, freedom of speech even. This comes at the very beginning when there was problems with King George and Great Britain. Guns, this is the right to bear arms. Now that has some limitations because there's a lot of commas in the original Constitution as to the right to bear arms, and it says like the militia in there. Does that mean somebody has the right to bear an AR-15? I don't know. That's where a lot of questions have come into play in years. Freedom of troops. You don't have to quarter or house troops. Now this is a lot because remember the Quartering Act of 1765? You don't have to house troops. You don't have to feed them. You don't have to open up your home to them. Warrants. This is that there can be no illegal search or seizure. And also, if you think back on this, it makes a lot of sense, especially for us in APUSH. When you think about what was happening with those customs officials, do you remember when customs officials were coming to basically like inspect if there was smuggling or things going on, and they were smuggling enumerated items that they could not send? And so basically you had to have a just cause, and you had to have a warrant to do a search, or you couldn't just illegally seize something. Silence. We remember silence by GEDD, G-E-D-D. And the first part of silence is you don't have to self-incriminate, which means you don't have to basically say you're guilty. And there was a landmark case on that court case document that I gave you, that kind of orange yellowish sheet. There's a famous court case that we'll get to in period 9 called Miranda versus Arizona. And we'll see that basically you don't have to pretty much confess to a crime in front of somebody. Like, you can have a lawyer present. Part of silence is a grand jury, and a grand jury essentially determines if there's enough evidence to go to trial. Is this even going to be worth our time? Eminent domain means the government can take your property with just compensation if it's for the common good. The government can't just go and say, well, you're out of your house because we just don't want you in your house. But if it's for the common good of like progress, the government can take your property, actually. Under silence is actually due process as well. And this is a series of steps to protect the rights of the accused, which makes also a lot of sense that if you are innocent until proven guilty, there are certain steps that need to happen in a process, in the correct order. And then double jeopardy. You can't be charged with the exact same crime twice. Okay, number 6 is actually 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Attorney, $20. Punishment, unenumerated rights, state powers. Attorney, $20. Punishment, unenumerated rights, state powers. So an attorney is just a right to an attorney. In fact, there's a little saying that if you cannot afford one, one will be provided. If you think back, that was what was happening when citizens in the United States were being sent to Great Britain for offenses that they had occurred in the United States or in the colonies. So the idea here was that you could face your accuser. You would have a jury of your peers. It would be an impartial jury, not biased. It'd be a speedy trial. Now, interestingly enough, a speedy trial, what at that time is definitely not what we consider to be a speedy trial today, could be years actually today, and a public trial. A public trial basically means that the trial happens in the area where the crime was committed. This is becoming a really big issue in the trial for the 3 officers, especially the first officer who was arrested in the murder of George Floyd. And so they're saying it shouldn't happen in Minneapolis, and then basically they're saying, no, it has to happen in Minneapolis according to the 6th Amendment. $20. This is an old one, but basically $20 is you have a right to a jury trial in cases involving any more than $20. Now, what I will say is in not civil trials, in I can't think of the word right now, but in a civil trial where it's just like a criminal, there's the word. In a criminal trial, there will be a jury of your peers. But in a civil trial, actually juries really only decide a very, very small amount of the cases. But if it's anything more than $20, you have the right to a jury trial. Punishment. This is that there can be no cruel or unusual punishment. This is really kind of important when you think of the morality of each state's stance on the death penalty. Should the death penalty be employed? Is that cruel or unusual punishment? Number 9 is unenumerated rights. Unenumerated rights basically say that there are more rights that people have, that citizens have, than what are listed in the Constitution. So if they're not listed, it doesn't mean that we don't have them. They really wanted to be, the founding fathers and those who kind of drafted the Constitution, wanted to be sure that we weren't limiting ourselves and we weren't trying to say, well, if it doesn't say it, it doesn't exist. This was more of a kind of a loose interpretation, if you will, of the Constitution. State powers. State power says anything not granted to the federal government is reserved to the state government, which once again makes a lot of sense if we think about and by the way, these first 10, remember these are called the Bill of Rights, these first 10 makes a lot of sense because this is what it took the first Bill of Rights to even get the Constitution passed, and a lot of it was the difference between state power and federal power. So much like unenumerated rights, states have more rights than maybe are granted to the federal government. For instance, education, speed limits, licensing, all those different things that the state power gives, not the federal power. All right. 11, state lawsuits. State lawsuits is basically that the government must stay out of state lawsuits. And what really had happened, and this is an old case, I want to say like 1793 or something like that, just after the ratification of the Constitution, that if you were an individual, you couldn't sue a state in federal court. And so state lawsuits said if you were going to sue a state, an individual is going to sue a state, it had to happen in the state court. It couldn't go to the federal level. Tickets. This is all about the president and the vice president, and it has everything to do with, remember the Revolution of 1800, the the big kind of change that happened with the election of Thomas Jefferson and the election of 1800. So what had happened is that the number one vote getter would be the president, and the number two vote getter would be the vice president. Well, could you imagine if that were the case today? But what had happened in the election of 1800 is that Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were actually running mates, and there was a tie between the two. Each of them got the same exact number of votes, but they were running mates. So it should have been that it went to, that they decided it in the House of Representatives, and this is actually where Hamilton comes into play, and he convinces people, mostly just because he doesn't like Aaron Burr. He doesn't like Jefferson, but he likes Burr even less. He convinces people to vote for Jefferson instead of Burr. And so after this, we realized that the president and the vice president need to be elected on the same ticket. Whoever you're voting for president, you are also voting for who they select as a vice president. One other thing on tickets, you have to know that the president and the vice president cannot be from the same state, which you also think about how powerful those states could become, or at least that's what the thought was in 1803 when they passed the 12th Amendment. States. Now, the tickets was 1803. We don't have another amendment until 1865, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments are known as the Civil War amendments. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865. Essentially, the 13th Amendment superseded it was an article in the Constitution that allowed for the Fugitive Slave Act for fugitive slaves to be returned. This went beyond that, and it abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment came soon after and gave citizenship rights, civil rights. CADE is the acronym we want you to remember, which means citizenship. So it gave citizenship to all Americans. A proportionate means that there was no more 3/5 compromise. You were counted as a full person. I should very much note that Indians were not counted as people of the United States, as citizens of the United States. There would be due process at the state level. We understand the due process. Again, we talked about due process there had to be a way to basically a series of steps to help those who are involved. And so when we talk about due process at the state level, we're saying things like a marriage, so gay marriage came up, abortion, and how each state basically gets to make some of those regulations on civil rights, on issues of civil rights. And then there would be equal protection under the law that basically says you can't, help a group of people beyond another group of people, whether it's legally, safety-wise, security-wise, economically, whatever it might be. Men is number 15. Basically, men says race cannot be used as a criteria for voting, and this is that all men can vote. Now, this came shortly after the Civil Rights Amendment. Excuse me. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were all kind of grouped together. So now black men had the ability to vote. The 16th Amendment. This is a graduated federal income tax, which basically all you really need to know is that for a long time it was almost impossible. There was a court case that came up, and it became a law that it was almost impossible to collect taxes. The federal government made it almost impossible to collect taxes. And so the 16th Amendment basically said, okay, there's going to be a graduated federal income tax, and it had to be, so now today it's based on your income. So if you make this certain amount of income, you pay this kind of percentage of tax. It's sometimes called a tax bracket. The 17th Amendment is the Senate, And this is there would be popular election of senators, means that they were no longer appointed by state legislatures, which is how it had been. You would vote for a state legislator, and then the state legislature would appoint the Senate. Now it went to direct popular election. The 18th Amendment, I don't know if any of you have ever heard stories or if you had parents who were Shanley alums of, what Mr. Rusted said, but Mr. Rusted started. He said, men tax, Senate booze women. And so 18 is booze. And this is all about prohibition. It outlawed, so please make sure that you know this. You should probably write it down. The 18th Amendment outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages. This is in 1917. Now, if you think back of that temperance movement that had been going on since like the 1840s, there was a strong push for prohibition. And it eventually comes in 1919 was when it was ratified, and it had been in effect for quite a long time. We'll see later that it's later rescinded and a new amendment's made. The 19th Amendment is women. We just hit the 100th year of the 19th Amendment. So in 1920, women could vote. Now, gender was not to be used as a criteria for voting. This is Susan B. Anthony who's really pushing it. But if you think back of the women's movement in the 1840s, 1850s, you think about people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and even the Grimke sisters who really fought for women's right to vote. So then the 20th Amendment. The way to remember the 20th Amendment is it says January 20-3. Think of the 20th Amendment and 20 comes first. So it all has to do with the start date for the president, which would be January 20th, and for Congress, which would be January 3rd. So think of the 20th comes first because it's the 20th Amendment. This is also going to be altered by another amendment that we'll talk about here in a second. So this is the start date for the President and Congress, January 20, January 3rd. The X just means the repeal of the 18th Amendment. So now Prohibition is over. Took 13 years to get there. It had been in effect for quite a long time. 22 is 2 times 2. Basically, it's saying that there were term limits set for the president, that you could only do 2 4-year terms. Now, that had been a precedent that had been set by Washington at the very beginning. Washington really set that precedent. But this happens in 1947 because it's after FDR had been elected 4 times to the presidency. There was never a law that said he couldn't. He just broke precedents. After that, they realized that probably is not a good idea. We need to make an amendment. 23 is DC, and this is electoral votes for those who live in DC. People who live in Washington, D.C. are not citizens of any state. They're federal citizens, but they get representation in the House of Representatives of the least populous state. So currently it's 3 for both North Dakota and Wyoming. And so D.C. gets 3 votes in their in the Electoral College. 24 is poll tax. This eliminated a tax to vote. Now, what is really sad is this didn't happen until 1962. Essentially, we had all this progress that was made with getting women to vote, getting black men the right to vote, or all men the right to vote. But there was still a lot of methods that were stopping people, corruption in voting, and one of them was a poll tax where you had to literally pay money to vote. You had to pass a literacy test to vote. And so the poll tax basically eliminated that, and it was part of kind of this civil rights movement to end the Jim Crow laws, and we'll talk more about Jim Crow as we get later into the periods. Succession, this is a big one. So succession happened a lot because, and so think of TV, transfer of power, and VP vacancy. Succession happened because we realized there was a problem after JFK was assassinated. John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and we had to figure out how transfer of power would happen. So there was a presidential succession, which in this order, the transfer of power would be, or the succession would be the president, the vice president, then the Speaker of the House, then the President pro tempore of the Senate, then cabinet positions in the order they were created. So when we talk about transfer of power, basically the president can temporarily transfer the power to the vice president, or Congress actually can request, the cabinet can request Congress to transfer the power to the vice president if there's a majority of people who feel like the president has lost their ability to lead. And so there can be a transfer of power. Most recently, I remember George W. Bush did this a couple of times when he was having some surgery, and he transferred power to his vice president Cheney, Dick Cheney. And it was just for a while, and then it can be rescinded. And then the VP vacancy basically says that the president must nominate a replacement if something happens to the vice president. 18 is they lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. The reason for this is this happened in 1971, and it was during the height of Vietnam when they were sending through the draft thousands of young men to Vietnam who could not vote. And they realized if you can go and fight in a war, you need to be able to vote. And so the age was lowered from 21 to 18. This actually modified the 14th Amendment because that had set the voting age at 21 for men. And the last one, a pay raise. This is our most recent amendment that I think it was in 1992 when it was ratified. This said Congress can set its own pay, but any changes, either an increase or a decrease in their pay, don't take effect until the next term begins, which is a good thing, I guess. What's funny is that this was originally proposed by James Madison, like 1789 in the original Constitution, with the original Bill of Rights, and it didn't actually get ratified until 1992, like 200 years later or something. So I want you to understand these. I want you to remember, first and foremost, freedoms, guns, troops, warrants, silence, attorney, $20, punishment, unenumerated rights, state powers, state lawsuits, tickets, slaves, civil rights, men, tax, Senate, booze, women, January 23, X 2x2, DC, poll tax, succession, 18, pay raise. Remember those, however you're going to remember those in the order, but it's probably just as important to understand the details of what each of those mean. So if you can do me a favor, after you're done taking that little quiz online, take a screenshot of it, upload it to Haiku. I don't want to take a grade on it. I just want you to do it, try it, see how you do. All right, until we meet again, talk